part of Stanford for me.
So basically these angles are the same, and then it hits here, and the same, and it goes on and on.
In the middle of, explaining something, she suddenly would get too excited and then lose track of what she had been talking about. She would jump to something without defining things.
When she was trying to describe some mathematical idea that she was grappling with, she would make these large hand gestures. She was very animated. She had these beautiful blue eyes, and you would see a light in them when she was excited about some mathematical thought that she was having.
She had this catchphrase, like, how can it be? If something had to be true, she'd be like, how can it be that this isn't true? How can it be? How can it be that this particular thing doesn't work? And it's just this phrase that she used, and then we'd work through it and be like, oh, okay, this is the things to think about.
So she had this very kind of visual way of thinking about everything. She'd write these pictures on the board, and then she'd draw kind of another picture on top of everything, and it was really kind of this very geometric way of looking at things.
She bought these large format notepads, and she started using them mostly on the floor. I think this is all about distributions of closed geodesics. You can see some surfaces here with holes, some hyperbolic surface. But certainly what you can see here is not the full complexity of the problem that she was thinking about. The full thing was only in her head.
One of her main achievements, which was recognized in her Fields Medal, was she solved a problem called Ratner's theorem for moduli space. And she did this working with two other mathematicians, Eskin and Mohammadi.
This problem that she solved stems from a very simple question. If you hit a ball on a billiard table, what are the possible ways that it could travel? Maybe it's going to roll into a corner, or maybe it's going to bounce around in a cycle, or maybe it's going to follow a more complicated trajectory. And here we might be talking about our usual rectangular billiard table, or we might take a more complicated shape like a triangle or a hexagon. And for most of these different shaped billiard tables, it's really hard to understand what the different possible trajectories are. But there's a way to transform this problem into a problem about the geometry of surfaces, which was one of Mirzakhani's specialties. So imagine that we've put a mirror along every side of our billiard table. When a ball hits one of the walls, it's going to bounce off. But in the mirror, it's going to look as if it's traveling along a straight line. When it hits a wall in that looking glass world, it just rolls straight into another looking glass world, and so on. So from this perspective, it looks as if the ball is just rolling forever along a straight line. We've simplified the path of the ball, but we've made the world that it's traveling through more complicated.
And instead of looking at the reflection, just continue the path. And so knowing things about this shape is the same as knowing things about the original billiard.
Now, for the kind of billiard tables Mirzakhani studied, it turns out that if you unfold your billiard table into this series of looking glass worlds, you're eventually going to get to one that's a perfect copy of your original billiard table, just shifted over. And any further unfolding is just going to give you repeats of things you've already seen. We can imagine that we take the last table before the repeat started and glue it to our original table instead of unfolding it onto a new table. And if you do all these different gluings, you end up with a surface. And this surface gets a very precise geometry that comes from the billiard table. This geometry is not the only billiard table geometry we could imagine our surface having. Maybe there's some other billiard table that glues up into the same surface, but with a different geometry that maybe makes the handles fatter or skinnier. Just as with Mirzakhani's earlier work, we can talk about a moduli space. But this time, our moduli space is a map of billiard geometries and related structures called flat geometries. So the torus we made out of a rectangular billiard table lives at one address on the map, and the torus we built from a triangular table lives at a different address. For understanding a particular billiard table, Mirzakhani used an approach that looks at all the different billiard geometries at the same time, in the moduli space. Our particular billiard table lives at some point in the moduli space map, But there are going to be other billiard table geometries that have a special affinity for our original billiard table. If we pick some trajectory on the table, we could imagine squashing the table in the direction of the trajectory and stretching it out in the perpendicular direction. That's going to produce a new billiard geometry, so it's going to move us to a new address in the moduli space map. Or we could shear the billiard table in the direction of the trajectory, and that's going to produce yet another geometry. These deformations move us to new points in the moduli space, but not to every possible point, only the ones that have this kind of special affinity for our original billiard table. And these points that we get to are called the orbit of our original billiard geometry. So we've translated our original problem about a ball rolling around on a billiard table into a problem about a point rolling to different locations in the moduli space. And if you could understand what this orbit looks like in the moduli space, that would tell you something about what the trajectories can look like in your original billiard table.
You can understand how many closed trajectories there are, how many ways a billiard ball can bounce back to itself. You can understand how a billiard ball spreads around on the table. All of these things come from understanding the orbit closure.
This is a problem that concerns surfaces with any number of handles, and it's kind of a big guiding conjecture in the field, and nobody knew if we would ever make progress on it.
And one of the goals is to understand the behavior of these orbits. Now, Ratner's theorem is a certain dynamical system which comes from homogeneous dynamics, in which you can actually understand the orbit of every single point.
I was lucky enough to make the first breakthrough on this problem by showing that it was true for surfaces with two handles, surfaces of genus 2. And I remember coming to my office one day and saying, well, why did you just do genus 2? And I sort of, it was sort of like saying, why did you just climb Mount Everest? Why didn't you climb all the mountains in the Himalayas?